Welcome to the quilt collection of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Within these walls are hundreds of quilts that tell the story of America, particularly American women of the 18th and 19th centuries. The DAR has been collecting quilts since the society itself was founded in 1890. Today, with about 350 quilts, the collection is acknowledged by scholars to be one of the most significant in the world.
What's interesting to me about the quilts in this collection is that they're really, truly documents of American history. We know who most of their makers are. We can do genealogical research and find out what their everyday life was like. It tells us about the way women lived in the 18th and 19th century.
Join us now as we take a look at some of the special quilts in the DAR Museum and the unique stories of America they tell. The wife of Francis Scott Key is one of the most prominent quilt makers represented in the DAR Museum's collection. Mary Taylor Lloyd Key, whose husband wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, made the quilt during the 1840s in Baltimore. The pattern for this pieced quilt was 5 blazing stars and shows a good example of the types of fabrics that were available to Baltimore quilt makers. 100 years later, in 1942, the counterpaint quilt was presented to the museum by Key's granddaughter. She wrote that the quilt was in storage from 1858 until 1925, when it was discovered with her grandmother's personal belongings. Like this bed cover, more than 80% of the DAR's quilts have a documented family history. Some of the quilts in the collection were donated because of their maker's relationship to historical American figures. For example, the second quilt presented to the museum was given because it was made by the niece of a hero of the American Revolution, Ethan Allen.
We don't know her name. Her name wasn't important. Who she was wasn't important. But the fact that she was related to this historic man, that's what was important. Today, we would be interested in who the woman was, what her social and economic position was, and try to find out as much as we could about her everyday life.
This quilt is designed in the central medallion style, a popular style during the classical period in America from 1780 to 1840. The appliqued grapevine wreath is one of the design icons of the period. The ruffle, which is original to this quilt, is a rare find because ruffles tended to wear quickly with use.
Tobias Watkins of Baltimore owned this quilt in the 19th century. It was probably made about 1800, and it's unusual because of its fabrics that were produced at the John Hewson's Printworks in Philadelphia in the late 18th century. And John Hewson was a British printer. He came to America, and during the Revolutionary War, Hewson joined up and fought in the Continental Army.
In 1776, John Hewson was commissioned a captain in the Philadelphia militia. 2 years later, he was captured by the British but escaped. On his return to Philadelphia, he found his print works destroyed. He struggled to reestablish his business after the war and finally made a go of it. Along with many prominent Americans of the day, one customer was Martha Washington.
Around 1915, a DAR member, Floretta Vining, gave her family's estate to the DAR Museum, a Massachusetts home filled with Revolutionary War and Federal period furniture, silver, ceramics, and textiles. 2 quilts came out of that estate that have significant importance because they're numbered. If you look on the backs, there are cross-stitched initials and numbers. One is numbered 1 and the other is numbered 3. And in the 18th and early 19th centuries, this was a common thing for the lady of the house to do to her bed covers and her linens. Catherine Parker Custis made this quilt around 1820. She was from Northampton County, Virginia, which is on the eastern shore. She lived at Deep Creek Plantation, which is still there. Note the applique. The applique is held down with a very, very, very fine and close together buttonhole stitch. And she signed in cross stitch her initials and her name at the base of the tree. The fabrics in this quilt, the birds for instance, were printed in England between 1760 and 1780, and they're block printed linens. The pieced border fabrics are roller printed linens from the 18 teens.
Catherine Parker Custis died in 1840 and was buried at her home, Deep Creek Plantation. Listed in the household inventory taken shortly after her death are 4 bed quilts. All were appraised at between $2 and $4. This appliqued and pieced quilt has now faded to a soft pink. The original colors were red and green chintz and a red calico border. The quilting and stuffing were expertly rendered, clearly the work of a highly skilled needlewoman.
There is a quilted inscription on this quilt, and it reads, "Made by Amelia Locke in the 62nd year of her age, April 15th, 1823. She and her husband, Peter Locke, who was a Revolutionary War veteran, owned the Red Lion Inn, which is still there today, and they lived at Edge Hill, and Edge Hill is still there today."
This quilt was created by Anne Pamela Cunningham, who is notable for founding the first preservation group in the country, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union. When George Washington's home was put up for sale, Cunningham spearheaded the group as it raised money, bought the home, and took over its operation. This quilt was made in 1836 with Eliza McKee's initials appliqued at the bottom. It's not clear if she made the quilt or if it was made for her. She lived in Western Maryland, which had a large number of German immigrants. Like the community, the quilt represents an assimilation of English and Germanic design traditions. The appliqué floral designs are indicative of a Germanic design tradition seen on decorative arts in Western Maryland in the early 19th century. And the quilt's medallion style illustrates an English classical tradition, also popular during the period.
My favorite quilt is probably the most unusual quilt in the collection. It's appliqued, and it's a maze. There's only one way out, all in red on white. It doesn't have exquisite quilting, but this maze design is just fabulous. For a while, we didn't know where the design came from, but we finally realized, after doing much research, that it was an identical maze to a mosaic that used to be on the floor of Amiens Cathedral in France. The DAR Museum is lucky to be the home to about 9 quilts, all made by the same woman. Her name was Anna Catherine Hummel Markey Garnhart, and she was probably the most prolific quilt maker of the 19th century. She was born in 1773 and died in 1860, and her quilts are rare. They're known for the fact that at least 80% of the quilt is done in inlay work or reverse applique. They're exquisite. Some have central baskets and some have eagles in the center. But she really is one of the only quilt makers in the 19th century that used this technique of reverse applique. She lived her entire life in Frederick, Maryland, at the corner of 3rd and Bent Street. Her house is still there, and we know where she got her eagle design because as the quilts were handed down in the family, so was a Liverpool transfer printed picture which has an eagle on it.
Mary Rooker Norris was married in 1811 and lived most of her life in Harford County, Maryland, and in Baltimore. The quilt was made for Mary's 1-year-old granddaughter. She drew an inked wreath and medallions on the quilt and inscribed in the middle of them significant dates in her family's history.
We look at this quilt and we realize that her drawing is much better than her needlework. The applique is a little chunky, you might call it, but her drawing is exquisite. Well, one of the things we found out about Mary Rooker Norris was that she taught drawing in the 1840s at her sister's girls' school. The most popular quilt in the collection is probably the quilt made out of 1812 British military uniform fabrics. It's all wool. It is quilted, but the designs are very sparse and not too skillfully done because, of course, you had to go through 3 layers, 2 of wool. Here in the 21st century, we're in the midst of a huge revival of quilt making. There are millions of quilt makers in this country, as well as many more millions in other countries. It's a billion-dollar business. And quilt makers today have really pushed the envelope with design and creativity. There's still, of course, many people doing traditional quilts, as well as lots of people doing very cutting-edge modern quilts. Donna Radner from Maryland is one of those quilt makers that assimilates both the traditional and the non-traditional. Her quilts are known for their explosive use of color and huge numbers of fabrics in them.